border. It's focusing on crime.
The themes of his campaign.
Yeah.
Which that totally makes sense to me. But I do want to push back on what David was saying about essentially saying that this is a problem that came from the Democratic side. And I would hope that we could take a little time off before we get to this. But the rhetoric out of the Republican side, out of Donald Trump himself or Don Jr. about the attack on Paul Pelosi, mocking him, making up a rumor that this was some gay sex event, right? And wasn't a terrible attack by someone who was politically motivated and could have taken his life. That is the genesis of this. This goes back to 2016.
Almost immediately after the failed assassination attempt of Donald Trump, the right tried to spin it. They tried to say that Democratic rhetoric was responsible for this, that comments from people like Joe Biden or late night hosts or comedians or other Democratic officials were responsible and fueled this attack. Of course, as we later learned, the shooter was a registered Republican and had a documented history of being a conservative. We shouldn't really expect ideological consistency from someone who's willing to do something like that that's so violent. That's just purely irrational. But we really need to take a look at the right's comments on violent rhetoric in the American political system, because it may come as a surprise to you, but the call is coming from inside the house. Let's take the case of Paul Pelosi, for instance. You remember that, where somebody broke into their house looking for Nancy Pelosi and attacked Paul Pelosi with a hammer. The person who did that was clearly radicalized by language from Trump and Fox News. I'll show you. But first, look at how they reacted to that attack.
Stand up to crazy Nancy Pelosi who ruined San Francisco. How's her husband doing, by the way? Anybody know? And she's against building a wall at our border, even though she has a wall around her house, which obviously didn't do a very good job.
He was using it as a punchline, and the supporters just went along with it. There was no clutching of pearls. Nobody was dissuading him or booing him for making that comment. They laughed and went along with it. And it wasn't just Trump. His son also did this. Here, Don Jr. posted a picture saying his Paul Pelosi Halloween costume was ready, making light of the fact the guy got his head cracked. And it didn't stop there. It wasn't enough that they were making fun of him for being attacked. They started booing him for some reason.
But the only crime victim you hear about from Democrats in the media is Paul Pelosi. Paul Pelosi was brutally attacked by a drugged out illegal alien that should have been deported. And Paul Pelosi should have been a gun owner and shot his attacker.
What is there to boo exactly? I mean, it's cruel, but I guess the laughing makes sense if you want to keep pointing fingers, but I'm not fully clear on what exactly they're booing. Just the mention of his name, I guess. And like I mentioned earlier, this was somebody who very clearly bought into what the right was pushing. You can see it here.
Social media posts included transphobic images.
All these nations preparing for World War Trans.
Linked to websites claiming COVID vaccines were deadly.
Is it possible that the vaccine actually can hurt you, especially if you keep getting boosted? Can it weaken your immune system?
The death rates being promoted are whatever they want to be promoted, as the death rate one post said.
So is it possible that the CDC has been classifying those deaths from old age or other factors, as coronavirus deaths?
Also posted links to YouTube videos with titles like Democrat Farce Commission to Investigate January 6th.
It's a farce. It's a complete farce.
Global elites plan to take control of your money.
They're hiring another 87,000 armed IRS agents just to make sure that you obey. Got it? Got it? Is it clear?
So it looks like we've potentially have somebody here who embraces conspiracy theories.
There is a clear through line between what he believed and what was broadcast on Fox News. You can see it in their own report, and they kept fanning these flames. Paul Pelosi is not just an isolated incident. Trump continues to overlook the violence in his own base, in his own party, and point fingers at the left.
But I happen to think that the radical left is far worse and far more dangerous than the right. I think a lot of people on the right are so disgusted with what they're seeing with the woke and all of the other things, the mutilation. It's very, very sad. And I don't know why that they're just not attacked.
And a lot of the comments we saw over the weekend were Republicans blaming Democrats for this attack, saying Democrats caused this by comparing Trump to Hitler. Of course, you want to be careful with how and when you use that because you don't want to devalue the severity of it. Let's closely examine some of the things that Trump said and whether or not they are similar to things that Hitler said. For instance, he said this about immigrants.
You know, when they let I think the real number is 15, 16 million people into our country. When they do that, we got a lot of work to do. They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just the 3 or 4 countries that we think about, but all over the world. They're coming into our country from Africa, from Asia, all over the world. They're pouring into our country. Nobody's even looking at them. They just come in.
Which prompted a response from the media pointing out that is very similar to something Hitler said about Jews.
Why do you use words like vermin and poisoning of the blood? The press, as you know, immediately reacts to that by saying, well, that's the kind of language that Hitler and Mussolini used.
Well, that's what they say. I didn't know that, but that's what they say. Because our country is being poisoned. Look.
And of course, there is so much more. He fanned the flames that led to January 6th. He celebrated the state-sanctioned violence in response to the George Floyd uprising. He celebrated police brutality throughout his tenure. And of course, with all this, we have to acknowledge that war is a form of political violence, just abroad, so therefore people don't care about it as much here. But we're also talking about somebody who assassinated a military figure in Iran and bragged about it. So the idea that Trump is opposed to political violence or has worked to quell violence is just untrue. Everyone, of course, has a responsibility to be careful with what they say if they have an audience, but it is rich getting lectures from the right on inciting violence when multiple mass shooters have left detailed manifestos describing exactly what they're doing and why, and those manifestos closely mirror monologues and speeches given by Ben Shapiro and Tucker Carlson and other right-wing media figures. And in response, the right will just shrug their shoulders, shake their head, and say, no, that wasn't us. We had nothing to do with that. We didn't inspire that. So I'm just totally disinterested in anything the right wants to complain about in regards to this weekend, because they are the ones that have been fanning the flames of violence in this country for years.